It did not happen all at once. There was no sudden fight, no loud argument, no clear moment where everything broke. It started quietly, so quietly that she almost blamed herself for noticing it. At first, she thought she was just tired, maybe thinking too much. Life had been busy, and busy minds often imagine problems that are not really there. But this feeling stayed. It followed her through the day and sat with her at night when everything else was silent. He was still there. That was the confusing part. He still came home, still sat near her, still listened when she spoke about small things. He nodded at the right times. He asked simple questions. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. Anyone watching them would say they were fine. But she felt something missing, something that could not be seen but could be felt deep inside. She remembered how it used to be. He once spoke with warmth, even when the topic was serious. His words had energy, and his eyes showed interest. When she talked, he leaned in, like her thoughts mattered. Now he leaned back, not far away, but far enough to feel the space between them. The first time she noticed it clearly was during dinner. She was talking about her day, about something that had bothered her at work. It was not a big issue, but she needed to share it. Halfway through her sentence, she paused. He was quiet, staring at his plate. He did not interrupt, but he did not respond either. When she finished speaking, there was a long pause. Then he said, and continued eating. She laughed it off. She told herself he was just tired. Everyone has quiet days. But the silence came back the next day, and the next. It slowly became part of their routine. Morning conversations became short. Evening talks faded into quiet moments, where only the sound of the television filled the room. She began to listen more closely, not just to his words, but to the way he used them. His replies were safe. They carried no risk, no emotion. Words like, "Okay, fine, and we'll see," became common. He avoided deep topics, and when they came up naturally, gently moved away from them without saying much. She tried to reconnect in small ways. She asked him about his thoughts, his worries, his plans. Sometimes he answered, but his answers felt empty, like they were given out of habit, not truth. She felt as if she was talking to a door that was slightly open but locked from the inside. At night, when they sat together, she noticed how often silence wrapped around them. It was not the comfortable silence they once shared, where no words were needed. This silence felt heavy. It made her restless. She wanted to ask him what was wrong, but something held her back. A quiet fear told her that asking might change everything. She started paying attention to small details. He no longer shared jokes the way he used to. His smile appeared, but it did not stay. When she looked into his eyes, they felt distant, like he was thinking about something far away. Sometimes she caught him staring at nothing, lost in thought, and when she asked what he was thinking, he said nothing too quickly. Her heart began to feel unsure. She questioned herself constantly. Was she expecting too much? Was she being sensitive? She did not want to accuse him of something she could not clearly explain. After all, he had not said anything hurtful. He had not walked away. He had not done anything obvious. But the heart does not always need obvious signs. It notices shifts that the mind tries to ignore. She remembered a moment from a few weeks ago. They were sitting together when something important came up. Something about the future. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with hope. She waited for his response. He stayed quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Let's talk about it later." Later never came. That moment stayed with her. It replayed in her mind again and again. She realized that his silence appeared most when things mattered, when emotions were involved, when choices needed honesty. That was when he went quiet. She felt lonely in a way she had never felt before. He was right there, yet she felt alone. It was a strange pain, harder than distance. At least distance has reasons. This silence had none, and that made it harder to understand. She tried to keep things normal. She smiled, laughed, and continued daily routines. But inside, she felt a slow ache. She missed feeling seen. She missed feeling chosen, not just present. One evening, she decided to test something. She stopped filling the silence. She did not start conversations. She waited to see if he would notice. Hours passed with very few words between them. He did not seem uncomfortable. That hurt more than she expected. She realized then that she was the one holding things together with words. Without her effort, there was nothing to hold. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She listened to his breathing and wondered what he was thinking. Was he unhappy? Was he confused? Or had he already made peace with feelings he never shared? She wanted him to speak, to explain, to say anything. But she also knew something deep inside her. If he wanted to talk, he would. His silence was not an accident. It was a choice. The next morning, she looked at him differently. Not with anger, but with awareness. She noticed how calm he seemed, how steady. Meanwhile, her thoughts were loud. She understood then that they were no longer standing in the same emotional place. She did not confront him. Not yet. She needed to understand her own feelings first. She needed to accept what she was slowly learning. Sometimes the truth does not arrive through words. Sometimes it arrives through what is missing as the days passed. The silence continued to speak. She began to hear messages in it she once refused to hear. His quiet was not empty. It was full of meaning, and deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of something she could no longer ignore. Life continued, but it no longer felt the same. She tried to go about her days with her usual energy, to smile at the small moments and find comfort in the familiar routines. Yet everywhere she looked, she could feel the weight of his silence pressing against her heart. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was persistent. It hung in the corners of the room, in the pauses between words. In the spaces where laughter used to be, she noticed that even the little things had changed. When they went out together, he no longer held her hand for long, or smiled in the same warm way. He seemed distant, almost as if his mind was somewhere else, locked away in thoughts she could not reach. Sometimes she wanted to laugh at something funny, only to see him staring blankly, unable to join her joy. It was a strange pain. Watching someone so close drift away while still remaining physically present, she tried to talk to him. She asked about his day, about his feelings, about anything that might open a door between them. His answers were short and careful, chosen not to reveal too much. There was no anger, no harsh words, only the quiet distance that slowly ate away at her hope. Every attempt to bridge the gap seemed to push it slightly wider. At work, she found herself thinking about him more than usual. She replayed conversations in her mind, searching for clues she might have missed. Was there a look in his eyes that said more than words? Was there a tone in his voice that carried hidden meaning? She started noticing patterns, little habits that now seemed significant. He scratched his face when nervous. He avoided certain topics. He always drank his tea slowly in the morning, as if taking time to organize thoughts he never shared. Every detail became a piece of a puzzle she did not yet understand. Friends and family noticed the change too. They asked if everything was okay, if there were problems at home. She smiled and said yes, even though a quiet worry sat in her chest. She did not want to explain what she could not fully name herself. The truth was not dramatic. It was not a betrayal or a fight. It was the slow disappearance of connection. The silent widening of a space she had once taken for granted. At night, the silence was even louder. Lying beside him, she felt the emptiness between them as keenly as if it were a physical barrier. She wanted to turn, to ask him why, to demand an explanation, but fear stopped her. What if asking the question changed everything? What if it confirmed the truth she dreaded? She stayed quiet, listening to the soft sound of his breathing, tracing the line of his profile in the dim light. The very presence she once found comforting now felt like a reminder of distance. She started noticing that he no longer shared dreams or plans for the future. Conversations about holidays, trips, or even simple weekend plans were met with vague agreement or polite silence. It was as if he no longer imagined a shared future, or if he did, he kept it locked inside. This realization hurt more than any argument could have. It was not about anger. It was about absence. The absence of shared dreams, shared excitement, shared life. One afternoon, She caught him staring out the window for a long time. The expression on his face was unreadable, but something in his eyes suggested a story he was not telling. She wanted to ask to break through the quiet that separated them, but she hesitated. She feared that any question might be unwelcome, that probing might make him retreat even further. She turned away, trying to focus on her own thoughts, but the image of him lost in silence stayed with her. She began to realize that his silence was not just a momentary mood. It was a pattern, a way of being that reflected deeper feelings he could not express aloud. She felt both sadness and understanding. Sadness for what was lost, understanding for what could not be forced. She understood that some truths cannot be spoken. Some feelings are shown not in words, but in quiet presence, in small gestures, in the spaces left unfilled. Days blended into nights, and she noticed that she was changing too. She became more careful with her words, more observant, more cautious. She learned to listen not just to what was said, but to what was left unsaid. She learned to see the signs in silence, the quick nod, the hesitant glance, the shift in posture. Every action, no matter how small, carried meaning. She realized that understanding him required patience, empathy, and attention, and that sometimes it was enough to simply notice without demanding explanation. At the same time, she struggled with loneliness. Even when he was near, she felt isolated. She longed for conversation, for laughter, for the ease they once shared. She remembered the days when they could sit in a room without speaking and feel complete in each other's presence. Now, even silence felt heavy, burdened with unspoken thoughts and unrealized emotions. It was a quiet suffering, one that required endurance and courage. She tried to seek comfort elsewhere. Friends became sounding boards, and small distractions helped, but the feeling of distance followed her. She could not escape it, no matter how much she laughed with others or immersed herself in work. It was like a shadow she carried, a quiet reminder that something in her life had shifted and could not be ignored. She started keeping small notes to herself, writing down observations and feelings she could not share aloud. She documented moments of his quiet, moments of his attention, and moments when he seemed lost. It was not about accusing or blaming, but about understanding. Writing gave her a way to process what she felt, to organize her thoughts when speaking seemed impossible or ineffective. One evening, after a particularly long day, she asked him if he was okay. The question felt heavy on her tongue, weighted with all the unspoken fears and doubts she had accumulated. He paused, looked at her, and said, "I'm fine." But she could see that he was not. Not really. His eyes avoided hers, and a tension lingered in his posture. She understood then that his silence was deeper than she had realized. It was not just avoidance. It was a way of coping, a way of protecting both himself and her from something they could not yet face. She did not push further. She knew that forcing words from him would not help. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we have to hear in their absence, the ones that show themselves not in speech, but in quiet gestures, in moments of stillness. She decided to wait, to watch, to understand in her own way. She realized that patience was necessary, that the truth would reveal itself if she paid attention. Over time, she learned to observe without judgment. She noticed the little things, the way he straightened a chair, the way he glanced at the sky, the small acts of care he still performed quietly. These actions spoke volumes, even if his words did not. She began to piece together a picture of him that was different from before, more nuanced, more real. She realized that love and understanding could exist even when conversation was limited, even when silence filled the spaces where words used to be, and yet the ache of absence remained. It was a subtle, persistent ache, like a shadow that never fully disappeared. She learned to carry it with her, to acknowledge it without letting it define her. She discovered a new strength in herself, a capacity for empathy and patience that she had not fully appreciated before. She knew that this was only the beginning of understanding, that more would come, and that the journey through silence would teach her lessons she could not yet imagine. The moment came quietly, in a way that she did not expect. There was no confrontation, no shouting, no dramatic revelation. It happened in the simplest of ways. During a normal afternoon, when the world felt ordinary, and yet it was extraordinary. They were sitting together, not speaking, each lost in their own thoughts. The silence had become familiar. Almost like a friend she neither wanted nor liked. She looked at him, really looked. And for the first time, she saw something she had been waiting for without realizing it. There was a tension in his shoulders, a hesitation in the way he moved, a guardedness in the way he spoke, or more accurately, the way he did not speak. She had noticed these things before, but today they seemed to form a pattern, a story that his words had never told. It was not an argument that brought clarity. It was an ordinary moment when she spoke about something personal, something that mattered deeply to her. Normally, he would have asked questions, shown interest, shared thoughts. Today, he remained quiet, and the quiet itself spoke. The lack of words, the space between them, conveyed a truth that she could no longer ignore. She realized then that he had changed in ways he could not explain. His silence was not indifference. It was something more complicated. It was honesty in its own form, a message sent without speaking. The truth was in what he did not say, in the pauses, in the careful avoidance of topics that might reveal more than he was ready to show. She understood that his silence had a language of its own, and she had finally learned to read it. The understanding did not come with relief. It was painful, sharper than she expected. Knowing without hearing, understanding without confirmation, carried a weight that words might have lessened, but never replaced. She felt a grief that was quiet but deep, a sorrow that settled in her chest like a heavy stone. It was the grief of realizing that someone you care for deeply has retreated. Not in anger, not in disdain, but in quiet truth. For hours afterward, she replayed the moment in her mind. She remembered the slight downward glance of his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands rested on his knees without moving. Every detail was significant. Every pause was meaningful. She understood that he was not hiding from her, nor was he rejecting her. He was simply unable or unwilling to say what his heart already knew. The day passed slowly. She moved through it mechanically at first, performing tasks, responding to messages, interacting with the world as if nothing had happened. But the truth lingered in her mind, refusing to be ignored. Even when she tried to focus on work, on friends, on small distractions, the clarity of that silent moment returned over and over. Insisting that she acknowledge it, she began to see patterns she had missed before. The little signs were all there. The way he avoided eye contact during certain conversations. The way he gave polite but distant responses to questions that once would have engaged him fully. The way he retreated inward when emotions ran high. Each moment now made sense in the light of the truth she had finally perceived. His silence had always been a form of honesty, a way of showing her something he could not put into words. That evening, she watched him closely, noticing every small gesture. He did not speak much, but the way he moved, the way he responded to her presence, carried meaning. She realized that love and understanding could exist even without words. His care was present in small acts, a cup of tea placed on the table just the way she liked it, a jacket draped over a chair for her comfort, a quiet glance that seemed to check in without asking. She understood then that silence did not always equal absence. Sometimes it was presence in its own subtle, difficult way. Yet the understanding did not bring peace. It brought a different kind of struggle. She wanted to speak, to reach out, to ask questions that had no answers. But she knew that asking would not change the truth. It would not make him speak, and it would not erase the distance that had grown between them. She learned that sometimes accepting a truth required restraint, patience, and courage. It required seeing the reality of someone else's inner life without trying to fix it, or force it to fit her expectations. She remembered conversations from weeks and months before, small moments that now seemed to carry hidden meaning. The times when he had been unusually quiet, the times when he had answered with carefully chosen words, the times when he had avoided topics that mattered. All those moments were pieces of a puzzle, and now she could see the picture. It was not the picture she had hoped for, but it was real. And that reality demanded recognition. Her emotions were complex. She felt sadness, yes, but also admiration for his honesty, even in silence. She understood that it took courage to live in truth without speaking it aloud, to carry feelings without expressing them. She realized that his quiet was not weakness, but a different form of strength, a way of being that she had never fully appreciated before. And though it hurt, she respected it. As the days passed, she noticed changes in herself as well. She became more observant, more empathetic, more patient. She learned to read between the lines, to notice subtle gestures, to understand emotions without needing them spelled out. She discovered that understanding another person could exist in silence, in attention, in the careful observation of small details. She realized that the human heart communicates in more ways than words alone. And yet, loneliness lingered. Even with understanding, she could not escape the ache of emotional distance. She longed for conversation, for connection, for the easy intimacy they had once shared. The quiet truths she had learned were not enough to fill the void. She missed the warmth, the shared laughter, the sense of being fully seen by someone she loved. In this moment of realization, she faced a choice. She could continue to wait, to hope that words might come, that conversations might deepen, that emotional closeness could be restored. Or she could start to prepare herself for a life in which some truths remain unspoken, in which understanding exists without full communication, in which love is complicated and silent. It was not an easy choice, and it was not one she could make quickly. It required reflection, courage, and honesty with herself. She spent hours walking through her thoughts, replaying memories, analyzing moments, questioning feelings. She wrote notes to herself, recording what she observed, what she felt, and what she feared. Writing helped her process the silent truth she had finally seen. It gave her clarity, even if it did not provide comfort. She learned to sit with the discomfort, to acknowledge it without letting it dominate her life. She began to notice small, subtle acts of care he continued to show. Even in silence, he was attentive. Even in quiet withdrawal, he made small gestures that spoke of consideration and concern. These gestures were faint, almost invisible, but they mattered. They reminded her that human connection is complex, that love can exist in forms that do not always fit expectations, and that truth can be present even when it is not spoken. The realization of his truth changed how she approached their relationship. She no longer demanded explanations or sought out words that might never come. She learned to observe, to listen, and to understand in her own way. She realized that sometimes the loudest truths are spoken in silence, and the deepest connections are felt, not articulated. By the end of that day, she felt a mix of grief and clarity. She mourned the loss of what once was, but she also acknowledged the reality of what existed now. She understood that his silence was not cruelty or disinterest. It was a form of honesty, a choice to live in a way that was true to himself, even if it was difficult for her to bear. And in understanding this, she took the first step toward accepting a truth she could not change but could learn to live with. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between them grew more pronounced. She had learned to live with the quiet, to understand the messages it carried, but the emotional weight of it pressed on her heart in ways she did not expect, even as she acknowledged his honesty through silence. The ache of knowing without hearing never fully left her. She tried to maintain her daily routines, to carry on with her work, to spend time with friends, and to enjoy the small moments of life. Yet every night, she returned to the same quiet space beside him, where the silence was no longer comfortable. It had become a mirror, reflecting everything she feared, the distance, the unspoken truths, the reality that someone she loved was not fully present in the way she needed. Her mind replayed countless scenarios. She thought of every moment when he had withdrawn, every time his words were carefully measured, every glance that seemed to hold more than he could express. She questioned herself constantly, wondering if she had done something to push him away. She had missed signs that would have allowed her to intervene. But deep down, she knew that this was not her fault. His silence was a reflection of his inner struggle, not a judgment on her. She noticed how much she had changed in response to his quiet. She had grown more patient, more attentive, more observant. She had learned to listen to the subtleties of behavior, to read emotions in gestures rather than words. She had discovered that empathy could exist without conversation, that understanding could be built in the absence of speech. But the learning came with a cost. Loneliness seeped into her bones, persistent and stubborn, reminding her of the gap that words might never fill. One evening, she attempted a small experiment. She asked him directly about something important, something that had been on her mind for weeks. She chose her words carefully, hoping to create a space where honesty could flourish. His response was quiet, almost non-committal. He nodded slightly and said, "I understand." That was all. No elaboration, no explanation, no assurance. It was enough to confirm what she had been sensing, yet not enough to ease the pain. She realized that his silence was not meant to hurt her. It was not avoidance in the cruel sense, but rather a way of managing feelings that he could not articulate. It was a barrier, yes, but also a form of protection, perhaps for himself, perhaps for her, or maybe for both. She began to see that the truth she had been chasing was not a secret he was hiding. It was a reality that existed quietly within him. Her grief became a companion, a quiet presence that she carried without complaint. She allowed herself to feel the sadness, the loneliness, the frustration, and the longing. She wrote in her journal every night, pouring thoughts and emotions onto paper that had no judgment, no expectation, no interruption. Writing became a release, a way to navigate the complex terrain of human emotion, a way to acknowledge the truth of her situation without trying to change it. She started to focus on the small gestures of connection he still offered, the way he made her favorite cup of tea in the morning, the way he remembered small details of conversations she had had with others, the way he adjusted his schedule to be there for her in subtle ways. These acts, though quiet and understated, spoke volumes. They reminded her that human connection is multifaceted, that love and care can be expressed in ways that are not loud or obvious, and that presence itself can be a form of communication. She began to notice her own strength emerging. She realized that she could endure the silence, that she could observe without demanding, that she could love without constant affirmation. This was a new kind of resilience, a maturity born of patience and understanding. She recognized that the journey through his quiet was shaping her, teaching her lessons she might not have learned otherwise, yet even with understanding and resilience, the pain remained. She longed for words, for conversation, for the kind of emotional closeness that had once been easy. The silence was honest, yes, but it was also limiting. It kept her from fully connecting with the person she loved, from sharing her own fears, her own hopes, her own vulnerabilities. The balance between understanding his silence and seeking connection was delicate and exhausting. She spent many nights awake, reflecting on their relationship, considering what it meant to love someone who communicates differently. She questioned the nature of love, the importance of words, the necessity of shared understanding. She realized that love is not only about happiness or comfort, it is also about endurance, patience, and empathy. Loving him meant accepting the truth of his silence while managing her own need for expression. One night, she had a revelation. She understood that his silence was a kind of truth that could not be spoken. It was honesty in its rawest form, a reflection of his internal world that could not be forced into language. She felt both relief and sorrow. Relief because she finally understood the meaning behind the quiet. Sorrow because the connection she craved could not be fully realized through silence alone. She decided to act differently. Instead of asking for explanations, she began to offer understanding. Instead of seeking words, she gave attention. She learned to be present in ways that transcended conversation, to create moments of connection that were subtle, quiet, and deeply human. She discovered that love could adapt, that it could survive even when expression was limited, and that understanding could be as powerful as spoken truth. She noticed small changes in herself as she embraced this approach. She became more patient with others, more sensitive to emotions that were not expressed aloud, more aware of the nuances of human behavior. She learned that the world is full of unspoken stories, and that the ability to perceive them is a rare and valuable skill. This awareness did not eliminate her pain. but it gave it meaning, a context in which it could exist without overwhelming her. She also began to find joy in unexpected places. A quiet laugh at a shared memory, a small smile exchanged across the room, a gentle touch that said more than words ever could. These moments reminded her that connection exists in many forms, and that even silence can carry warmth, care, and love. She learned to cherish these instances, to recognize their significance, to allow herself to feel gratitude for them. Despite these lessons, she knew that the journey was far from over. The silence still held mysteries, still contained unspoken truths that she might never fully grasp. She accepted this uncertainty, understanding that some aspects of human relationships cannot be controlled or predicted. She embraced the challenge, recognizing that growth often comes from navigating discomfort, facing the unknown, and learning to live with complexity. Over time, she developed a quiet confidence in her own ability to manage the emotional landscape of their relationship. She no longer feared the silence in the same way. She learned to coexist with it, to interpret it, and to respond with empathy rather than frustration. She understood that the depth of human emotion is not always expressed through words, and that true understanding sometimes requires observation, patience, and intuition. She also recognized the importance of self-care. She nurtured her own interests, maintained friendships, and engaged in activities that brought her joy and fulfillment. She realized that her emotional well-being could not be dependent solely on another person's willingness to speak or share. By taking responsibility for her own happiness, she found balance and resilience, enabling her to approach their relationship with clarity and compassion as weeks turned into months. She noticed subtle shifts in him as well. He remained quiet, yes, but there were moments when his attention lingered, when his gestures conveyed care without words, when his presence offered reassurance. These glimpses reinforced her understanding that connection does not always require speech, that love can persist even in silence. She learned to celebrate these moments, to see them as affirmations of the bond that remained, however quiet or understated it might be. Through this process, she came to understand that human relationships are complex, multifaceted, and often contradictory. Love, she realized, is not always about constant affirmation, grand gestures, or endless conversation. Sometimes it is about endurance, empathy, patience, and the ability to perceive meaning in subtle, unspoken actions. She accepted that their relationship, like all relationships, required effort, understanding, and adaptation. By embracing this perspective, she found a measure of peace. She acknowledged the reality of his silence, honored her own need for connection, discovered a way to navigate the space between them with grace and empathy. She understood that while silence can be painful, it can also be a conduit for truth, a means of expressing emotion that words cannot capture, and a challenge that encourages growth and resilience. Time passed, and she grew stronger in ways she had never expected. The silence that had once weighed heavily on her heart no longer felt like a burden in the same way. She had learned to navigate it, to understand it, and to find meaning in it. She had learned patience, empathy, and self-awareness, and in doing so, she had discovered a new strength within herself. Even as the quiet persisted, she no longer felt alone in the same way. She had cultivated an inner world rich with thought, reflection, and understanding. She had nurtured her own interests, pursued personal growth, and maintained friendships that offered support and joy. In doing so, she had realized that love and connection are not only about two people sharing words and moments, they are also about the resilience, insight, and care that each person brings to the relationship. She continued to observe him, not with expectation, but with awareness. She noticed the small gestures that still conveyed care, the cup of tea left by her side, the soft glance that checked if she was okay, the way he adjusted to her routines without being asked. These quiet acts, subtle and often unnoticed by others, reminded her that love can exist in many forms and that understanding does not always require speech. She learned to celebrate these moments quietly, finding satisfaction and meaning in the ways he expressed himself without words. She also became aware of the lessons she had learned from their time together. She understood that human connection is complex, nuanced, and often silent. She recognized that patience and empathy are as vital to a relationship as communication. She realized that truth can be conveyed not only through words but through gestures, presence, and attention. And most importantly, she discovered that accepting someone as they are, even with silence or emotional distance, is an essential part of love. The quiet taught her about boundaries as well. She understood that it was not her responsibility to fill every void, to extract words that he could not offer, or to demand emotional expression where it could not exist. She learned to honor her own needs while respecting his, to maintain her own emotional health without attempting to change him. This balance was delicate, but it brought a sense of calm and clarity that had been missing in the earlier stages of their relationship. She found herself thinking about how much she had grown. The experiences that had once felt painful and isolating now seemed like lessons in resilience and understanding. She realized that love is not only about joy and comfort, but also about endurance, reflection, and the capacity to hold complex emotions without judgment. She had learned to hold her own feelings alongside his, to navigate the quiet, and to embrace the truths that silence revealed at times. She felt a gentle sorrow for what could never be fully expressed, for the conversations that would remain unspoken, and for the emotional closeness that might never be completely realized. Yet she did not allow this sorrow to consume her. Instead, she acknowledged it, honored it, and then released it. She learned that some forms of grief are not meant to be eradicated, but to be carried with grace. Shaping the way one understands and interacts with the world, her connection with him evolved into something quieter, subtler, but no less meaningful. She learned to find intimacy in shared glances, in gestures of care, in the presence of someone who was physically there even when words were scarce. The depth of their relationship was no longer measured by conversation alone, but by the consistent attention and quiet consideration they showed one another. She understood that love can thrive in many forms, and that silence does not always equate to absence. As she embraced this understanding, she also embraced herself. She realized that her own voice mattered, even when it was not echoed or reflected. She recognized her worth and her capacity to give and receive love on her own terms. She learned to find fulfillment in her actions, her thoughts, and her presence. Understanding that emotional resilience and self-awareness are powerful tools in navigating any relationship over time. She noticed subtle changes in him as well. While his words remained few, there were moments when his actions conveyed reassurance, care, and attention. He began to offer small, deliberate gestures that seemed to acknowledge her presence and her needs without requiring speech. These gestures, quiet yet significant, reinforced the understanding she had developed, that love can manifest in many ways. And that connection is not always verbal. She also realized that their journey had taught her lessons that extended beyond their relationship. She had learned to be patient, empathetic, and observant in all her interactions. She had learned to listen with her heart, to perceive meaning in actions as well as words, and to accept the complexity of human emotion. These insights enriched her life, making her more compassionate, understanding, and aware of the subtle ways in which people communicate and connect. One evening, as they sat together in quiet companionship, she felt a sense of peace she had not known before. The silence was still present, but it no longer carried the weight of uncertainty or pain. It had become a space of reflection, understanding, and gentle connection. She realized that she could honor both her own feelings and his, that she could coexist with the quiet without losing herself, and that love could persist even when expressed in subtle, understated ways. She understood that the journey through silence had changed her. She had learned to accept reality, to appreciate subtle gestures of care, to nurture her own emotional health, and to find meaning in quiet connections. She realized that the truth she had been seeking was never solely in words, but in presence, attention, and understanding. She had discovered a deeper level of emotional intelligence, resilience, and empathy that would serve her in all aspects of life. As time moved on, she embraced a sense of balance. She no longer sought constant affirmation, but instead found comfort in knowing that care and attention can exist even when unspoken. She had learned to find joy in subtle connections, to appreciate the quiet expressions of love, and to respect the boundaries and truths that silence can hold. Her heart had grown stronger, wiser, or more capable of enduring complexities without losing hope. In the end, she realized that love, patience, and understanding are not always measured in words. They are measured in the small, consistent acts of care and the ability to coexist with silence, and in the capacity to see and respect the truth in another person, even when it is not fully expressed. She had learned that relationships are not always about dramatic gestures or endless conversation, but about the quiet, steady presence of someone who cares, and the strength to honor both their truth and her own. With this understanding, she felt a sense of closure and empowerment. She had navigated the challenges of silence, discovered the depth of human connection beyond words, and learned to love with patience, empathy, and resilience. She knew that the journey was not over, that life and relationships would continue to bring challenges, but she felt prepared, grounded, and at peace. She had heard the truth in his silence, and in doing so, she had found her own voice, her own strength, and a profound understanding of love that would guide her in all the days to come. Time had moved on, and she found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The silence that had once seemed unbearable had transformed into a source of insight. It had taught her lessons about patience, understanding, and the subtle ways people communicate their feelings. She realized that human connections are more complex than she had imagined, that words are only one part of expression, and that love can exist quietly, without fanfare or declaration. She had grown in ways she had never expected. Her empathy had deepened, her patience had strengthened, and her ability to read the nuances of human behavior had sharpened. She noticed small signs of emotion and care in people around her, in ways she had overlooked before. The lessons she had learned from navigating his silence were not confined to their relationship. They had shaped the way she interacted with the world, the way she listened, and the way she offered support to others. Her own voice had become stronger as well. She had learned to assert herself without fear, to express her needs gently yet firmly, and to respect her own boundaries, even while honoring the realities of someone else's limitations. The balance between her understanding and her self-care was delicate but crucial. She realized that loving someone does not mean losing oneself, and that emotional resilience is a necessary companion to empathy. As she reflected on their shared history, she saw patterns she had not noticed before. The moments of care, the small gestures of attention, the brief glances of reassurance, all of these had been there even in the midst of silence. The truth had always been present. She had simply learned to recognize it over time. Understanding that truth required observation, reflection, patience had been one of the most important lessons of her journey. She also recognized that their relationship had changed her perception of love. Love was not always about words, dramatic expressions, or constant validation. It could be quiet, consistent, and subtle. It could be expressed through actions rather than speech, through presence rather than proclamation. And sometimes, the most profound truths were revealed not through conversation, but through careful attention to what was left unsaid. Even as she embraced these insights, she felt a bittersweet recognition of what could not be. There were conversations that would never be held, feelings that would never be fully expressed, and emotional closeness that might never be completely realized. She accepted this with grace, understanding that part of loving someone is accepting the limits of what they can give. Her strength lay in her ability to acknowledge these limits without resentment or blame. She noticed the subtle ways he continued to communicate. A hand placed gently on the table, a quiet presence beside her during difficult moments, a small act of care done without expectation. These gestures spoke volumes. She realized that love can persist in silence, that connection can thrive without constant dialogue, and that understanding can exist even when words are scarce. Her appreciation for these quiet expressions deepened her respect and affection for him. At the same time, she cultivated her own sources of joy and fulfillment. She pursued hobbies, nurtured friendships, and explored personal interests. She discovered that her happiness did not depend solely on the words or attention of another, but could be created and maintained through her own actions and choices. This independence strengthened her resilience, allowing her to navigate the complexities of their relationship with clarity and emotional stability. She also began to mentor others. Sharing the insights she had gained from her experiences, she spoke of patience, empathy, and understanding. She encouraged people to listen carefully, to observe closely, and to recognize that communication extends beyond words. She found fulfillment in guiding others to see the value in subtle gestures, in quiet presence, and in the acknowledgement of unspoken truths. There were times when she still felt the ache of distance, when the silence reminded her of the emotional space that could not be crossed. Yet she had learned to sit with that discomfort, to acknowledge it without being consumed by it, and to use it as a guide for understanding herself and others. She realized that emotional resilience is not about eliminating pain, but about navigating it with awareness, grace, and insight. She observed how he had also grown, even if silently. His quiet presence became more intentional, more attentive, more considerate. The gestures of care, though still understated, carried deeper meaning. She recognized that both of them had adapted to the reality of their relationship, finding ways to connect and support each other despite the limitations of verbal expression. This mutual adjustment reflected a subtle, profound form of love that endured through patience and understanding. As time went on, she found a sense of peace she had never known. The silence was no longer a source of anxiety or fear. It had become a space of reflection, learning, and gentle connection. She understood that love does not always require words, that empathy can exist without explanation, and that meaningful bonds can thrive through observation, attention, and respect. She often reflected on the journey they had shared. The early days of subtle shifts, the painful recognition of distance, the gradual understanding of his silence, and the eventual acceptance of unspoken truths, all of these moments had contributed to her growth. She appreciated the journey, even with its challenges, for the insights it had provided and the strength it had cultivated within her. Through it all, she discovered the power of patience and perspective. She realized that human beings express themselves in diverse ways, and that recognizing and honoring those differences is essential for meaningful connection. She learned that silence can be a language of its own, carrying truths that words sometimes fail to convey. Understanding and respecting this language had transformed her approach to relationships and deepened her emotional intelligence. She also recognized the importance of self-compassion. She forgave herself for the moments of doubt, for the frustrations, and for the longing that had at times overwhelmed her. She understood that navigating complex emotions is part of being human, and that self-kindness is essential for maintaining emotional balance. This awareness allowed her to engage with the world and with others from a place of strength and authenticity. Ultimately, she embraced a new vision of love and connection. She understood that relationships are not always measured by conversation or verbal expression, but by the quiet attention, subtle gestures, and consistent presence that sustain them. She appreciated the beauty of understanding without words, of empathy without explanation, and of care without expectation. This perspective gave her a profound sense of fulfillment and emotional maturity as she continued to live her life. She carried these lessons with her. She approached new relationships with insight, patience, and respect for individuality. She nurtured connections with family, friends, and colleagues with awareness of the subtle ways humans communicate. She celebrated small gestures, valued quiet presence, and honored the complexity of emotions in herself and others. In reflecting on her journey, she realized that hearing the truth in his silence had changed her profoundly. It had taught her about love, resilience, empathy, patience, and self-awareness. It had shown her that connection is multifaceted, that understanding requires attention, and that emotional depth can exist even without words. She had learned to embrace reality, appreciate subtle expressions of care, find fulfillment within herself. And so, she moved forward with a quiet confidence. She understood that life and relationships would continue to present challenges, but she was equipped with the insight, resilience, and empathy to navigate them. She had discovered the profound meaning of silence, the enduring power of subtle connection, and the value of understanding and accepting the truths that exist beyond words. In hearing the truth in his silence, she had found strength, clarity, and a deep, abiding sense of peace.